twice welcome, and I'm extremely happy that my past link to Charlottesville was brought up. Let me just say 2 words about it. We came down from Columbia University, where I was assistant professor, in a rickety Oldsmobile from 1949 with a practical hole in the floor so that if the brakes didn't function, we could always put down the leg. I bought it for $100, Pier 42, when the Norwegian-American line came to New York. And the task was to understand the desegregation process. We interviewed 243 people, some of them 6 times, and suddenly, at one point, it became clear that we knew the town better than the sheriff and the mayor. And there was one deep, deep worry: will there be violence in Thomas Jefferson's honored, venerable place? And more the pressure was on me to do something which at that time was quite impossible. To combine the objective role of the sociologist with being a mediator. And I had an agonizing night in a motel, and I decided in favor of the latter. So there was no book, but there was a mediation. As a matter of fact, in this book called 50 Years, 100 Peace and Conflict Perspectives, there is a chapter on Charlottesville. And Charlottesville was then the first place where I launched myself on the second track of my life as a peace professional activist. So Charlottesville is deep in my heart. I've been back many times since that time. And I would like to express a particular gratitude to Anne and Mel Norford, who are sitting here. And as you can imagine, they come from the Norford Lane. And that is up on Route 20 North, where they own land corresponding more or less to Monte Carlo, Monaco, or something like that. So a modest little piece. Beautiful. What I'm going to do now is to start by 5 aspects of the Arab Revolution. The first one is the one that is picked up by US media. It's terribly important. It's against dictatorship. It's against civil and political human rights, trying to promote them, the dictatorship trampling on them. The second aspect of 5 is against inequality, corruption, unemployment, misery, poverty. 40% of the 350 million Arabs living in poverty. The third aspect is against 2 empires, the US World Empire and the Israeli Regional Empire. Now, what's the link between number 1, 2, and 3? It's a very clear and very important one. An empire is not the same as colonialism. Under colonialism, you send your own people to administer the colony. Under an empire, you create an elite by propping it up, by supporting it. That elite you can almost always find somewhere. And it's usually rewarded in 2 ways. If you elite suppress, oppress, repress your own people, we will turn the back to that, we don't see it. And if you elite exploit, suck, corrupt your own people, and whatever extra value is produced ends up in your own pockets, we'll turn our back, we don't see that one either. But it's one condition, that you remain faithful to our political task. We are willing to pay you, we are willing to bribe you, but if you should defect, you might be in for quite a punishment. Now, elites have been functioning within empires for ages. There's nothing new about it. A clear example will of course be the way in which PLO was corrupted on the West Bank, and the Al Jazeera revelations published in The Guardian gave all the details about it. The son of Mubarak was Bank of America's representative for the Middle East. And Ben Ali in Tunisia was the link between CIA and Solidarność when he was ambassador in Poland in 1980. In other words, these were people that were serving the imperial interests and were doing it for a very long time. And the Camp David peace accords, of course, being the best example, over the back of the Palestinians, talking about them sometimes as displaced persons. The agreement was an agreement between Egypt and Israel that contained a ceasefire, a negative peace treaty, and an agreement of mutual non-attack that later on was expanded to cover the Gaza situation, where Egypt would pledge itself to cooperate with Israel in what in reality is very close to starving the Gaza population. That Israel would watch from the air and from the sea, and Egypt would take care of the tunnels. So we saw it very clearly when this thing started. The only question that came from Tel Aviv, Jerusalem was, will you keep the international treaties? I don't think a very diplomatic statement. And a major thing happens in a neighboring country. People yearning for freedom. Yearning for freedom. And seemingly coming close. Your only concern is your own egocentrism. Namely, what will happen to the treaties where we are involved. That they are concerned with that, I can understand. But a little concern for others might be helpful. Now, point number 4 and number 5. These are a little bit different, and what I have said already is also a little bit different from the mainstream discourse. Point number 4 is the youth revolt, and point number 5 is the woman revolt. It's there all the time. And if you know these countries, you will know it quite well. Let us have a look at the youth revolt. It started in 1963 in Latin America. It came in 1966-67 to China, known as the Cultural Revolution. All of these had different tonalities and colors, and there were other things going on. But there was one thing in common: very young people. In 1968, it exploded in Paris. And when something happens in Paris, the West will appoint that as the beginning. Because any causal chain will have to originate with us. And then it has to proceed from there. But from there it went all over Western Europe. No doubt about that. My wife and I met at the airport in Paris the day the whole thing exploded. And it was a little bit difficult to drive into Paris because there was so much tear gas. And I also understood very quickly that I should be careful parking my car, because the streets were so crowded with police and demonstrators that the only way to proceed was to jump from one car to the other. And if you jump from one car to the other, depending on your weight, you might make a dent in the roof. In other words, be careful where you park when there is a revolt going on. Now, where did it go then? It came to United States of America, to universities. And from that point on, FBI has had people stationed at universities all over the US. I remember once at the University of Hawaii, when I was starting my function there, a party, where I of course introduced myself, and the other person introduced himself. And when I introduced myself to one person, he said, you wouldn't like to know what I am doing. Now that made me a little bit curious. He was the FBI representative and they are on all universities. Okay, we leave that aside. It went to Japan, and very forcefully. It is now in the Arab world. The idea that youth can take initiatives, that youth can be carrying the banner, and particularly so students, or the unemployed younger academics, doesn't come easily to a patriarchal country or nation that has a tendency to reward age and the elderly. And then as number 5, the woman revolt. Now that became very, very important. And the most important feminist revolt came from the United States of America. It's the only revolution that I know that has ever come from the USA. I don't count the American Revolution as a revolution. That was a reaction against sharing spoils of the empire with London, wanting to have all the spoils themselves. I don't find anything particularly revolutionary in that. Independence, yes, but not revolution. And the same can then be said about the way the working class has been treated in this country. But the feminist revolt has a genuine, absolutely terribly important American stand on it. It may be objected that mostly it was Manhattan, and it was Midtown Manhattan, and the condition for participating was that you were either a psychoanalyst or had recently been psychoanalyzed. So it has a particular sort of touch to it, but it worked. It spread all over the world. It spread to the Arab world. You'll find all these 5 elements in what happens. And let us now put it this way. Imagine you have a country that is extremely autocratic, very inegalitarian, with poverty at the bottom, and a corrupt elite putting lots of money in its pockets. At the same time being at the service of the 2 empires. At the same time being run by the elderly and by males. Score -5. Egypt. A clear case of -4. Tunisia, -3. Or let us say -4. Tunisia was the first Muslim country in 1956 to declare parity between man and woman. You will find in Tunisia women all over, with or without the hijab. You find it all over. If you look at the video from the Tunisian revolt, you will see an enormous amount of women participating. Much less so from the Egyptian. Much, much less so from the Libyan. So let me then give Tunisia -4. Then come to Libya, and we are distributing grades. And you will understand the way I'm operating now as a sociologist. Thank you, Professor Quant. I have a past. I cannot deny it, and I'm proud of it and happy about it. The point about it is this. The more minuses you have, the more easily will the revolt proceed. But if your profile is a little bit more mixed, you will have problems. Libya, autocratic. The inequalities, the way they managed that was a traditional Arab way. Namely, to import foreigners, pay them badly, but better than at home. The wife of Ferdinand Marcos, Imelda Marcos, told me once that she was in a tent with Gaddafi, and Gaddafi was teaching her Arabic. And for the honor of teaching her Arabic, she exacted a honorarium, Now, usually it's the professor who gets some honorarium, but if you think that it applies to Imellamarcos, you don't know Imellamarcos. And the honorarium was to accept, I think it was 30,000 Philippine women as maids, as babysitters. And they were paid better than they would be at home, and they were abused. In other words, the inequality was less inside Libyan society. Ottoman Empire. The 1969 September revolution of Muammar Gaddafi, a 27 years old colonel, was against both empires. I was in an Al Jazeera debate just right before I came here. I was from the Charlottesville studio. And it was pointed out very correctly by a former Israeli ambassador to the US, who was on the panel, that there isn't much revolution left in Gaddafi today. No, but there is the magic. There is the aura. Or the one who stood up and who followed in the footsteps of Naguib Nasser. The footstep was to reject the empire. So let us look at that just with a slight historical perspective. This is the third Arab revolt against empire, what we're experiencing now. The first one was from 1915 against the Ottoman Empire. And it was encouraged by UK and France and Russia. And they were told that if you rise against the Turkish Empire, you will get freedom. What they got was that France colonized two, Lebanon and Syria, Lebanon, Syria, and the UK colonized Iraq and Palestine. Wherever the UK has colonized, they have produced major world problems afterwards, whereupon they withdraw and wash their hands in London, good at the hand washing business. So then came the Second Revolt. This is known as the Sykes-Picot treason in the Arab world. Sykes being the British foreign minister, Picot being the French. So the Second Revolt was against the French-English domination. That revolt was spearheaded by Naguib Nasser from 1952. I do not want to retrace the whole history, but one important point was, of course, the nationalization of the Suez Canal. And that happened in 1956. And 29 October 1956, France and England attacked, bombed Egypt, particularly Suez Canal parts, and Israel invaded Sinai and occupied it. The United States came out against it, not as Eisenhower. Eisenhower withdrew the financial support to Israel and reproached France and England. France and England stopped. Why did the US do that? Well, from one point of view, I think it was a genuine anti-colonial move. Very much in the US narrative about itself is against a certain King George, and he doesn't get a very good certificate in the Prolegomena and the preface to the Declaration of Independence. So what happened then was that this looked like a replay. It would, in a sense, be difficult for the US not to be against at the time. When it comes to Israel, Israel kept Sinai for some time and then withdrew. US became then the third imperial rule. And this became very clear from 1967, when US became an ally of Israel, who before that had had the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia as ally, and France, Norway. France and Norway helped Israel build the atomic bomb. From 1967, it was the US. For the US to overcome its history of anti-Semitism was not easy. But Judeo-Christianity was hyphenated, and that hyphen then applied to Israel, US, and the hyphen has stuck up to our days. And one aspect of that is, of course, that when the Congress is trying to cut the budget to do something about a bankrupt country, the United States of America, only Rand Paul is arguing about cutting the aid to Israel. And when it comes to the military budget, only his father, Ron Paul, is arguing. Maybe we have a choice between welfare and warfare. In other words, there is a solidity to military interventionism and to the hyphen I just mentioned. Nasser made stupidities. One stupidity was the 1967 attack on Israel. Came out of it extremely badly, also as a military man, which he was, and died in 1970. The year before he died, Gaddafi walked into his footsteps. So the narrative that I have now presented is the narrative on the mind of most people in the Arab world. They will in no way deny that he is an autocrat. But if you now give him -1 for autocracy, you jump the inequality because it may be said not to be intra-Arab. You give him a +1 for anti-empire. You give him a -1 for not recruiting youth and a -1 for women. You suddenly see him as a difficult, ambiguous case. So I made immediately the prediction: it won't work like Tunisia and Egypt. It won't work. There will be loyalty, solidarity with Gaddafi, however bad he is. And there will be opposition, however true his reputation against the empire is. And who would be on his side? Probably people who are not anti-empire. So when you ask, what does the opposition stand for in Libya? My guess will be is that they stand for the West. They don't stand for Israel, but for the West. Whether they have already been bought by the West, MI6, would be my suspicion. I have absolutely no evidence. I don't know. But I'll give you one guess. They are right now in London discussing the future of Libya. And the guess will be that the opposition will discover a very high level of readiness to accept DFI, direct foreign investment, from France, Italy, and the US in the oil industry. So we have an underlying clear US, UK, French interest. If it is possible to squeeze that much money out of oil so the oligarchs can become that rich, how about getting rich, getting rid of the oligarchs, promote democracy, and get that money for yourself? If Mubarak can get away with $70 billion, it should be possible for some Western firms to do the same. I say it's an educated guess. How do I say that? Why? Well, simply because this is exactly what they did in Serbia, Kosovo. Exactly what they did. I can go into details with it, but let's leave that aside for the time being. Let us move further. How about Yemen? Clear case of -5. How about Saudi Arabia? Clear case of -5. How about Bahrain? Clear case of -5. How about Syria, Iran? A little bit more problematic. Syria and Iran have stood up against the empires. Both very autocratic. but that will produce an ambivalence in the mind of many. And you will probably get as a result youth and women revolting, which is very much the case in Iran. And you will get people with the opposite profile, gender generation-wise, but with very much concern for geopolitics on the other side. Now, since the empire cannot be mentioned in US mainstream discourse, doesn't exist. It is blocked out. Blocked out. Then the American people is left with a very incomplete discourse to understand what's going on. Let us now for a second look at Saudi Arabia. Who are standing up? Academics. They have produced a very, very fine document. And in that document they are arguing the best the West has to offer. Equality for the law, abolition of the monarchy, and here I think they make a very clever move. They do not argue republic, they argue constitutional monarchy. I myself come from one, Norway. It's not my ideal form. Sometimes one is disgusted with ridiculous and snobbish aspects. But it's a relatively low price to pay for a relatively decent system. They are arguing the rule of law. They are arguing multi-party elections. They are arguing accountability to a National Assembly. And as I mentioned, supervision of the appointment of the next king. They have something between 3,000 and 5,000 to choose from princes and crown princes. They have been very prolific in producing progeny, these people. So there's much of a choice. There's a special organ that makes the choice. They are arguing control of that organ. Why don't we have youth in the streets? They'll probably be killed immediately. In other words, you have to have a high status and be relatively invulnerable to argue. So the argument would come when there is a religious rift between Shia and Sunni. And as you know, that is Bahrain, a Shia majority, ruled over by a Sunni minority, with the opposite profile in Saudi Arabia. So if I now should predict something, I would do the following. In Egypt and Tunisia, the empire will try to find a foothold in a default position. And the first foothold is to sacrifice the top person. Let Mubarak go, Ben Ali go. And then trying to repeat that with Libya without understanding the difference. And in the quagmire of that difference, right? The position then would be to keep the body intact, but cut off the head. Will that stand? Adapted. The -5 in Egypt and the -4 in Tunisia will make the opposition too strong. And right now you will see that the military, right now they have a military dictatorship, but they are yielding. What will be the next position? Well, the next position will probably be let democracy come. Let it be the way we like to have it in the West, or we think we have it in the West. And then make use of democracy to be invited for investment. And through the investment, massive investment, snatch oil away from China and get it to France and Italy instead, from Egypt and Libya. Spain is also interested in that. Turkey is a part of the NATO coalition, but playing a very ambivalent role.